Abigail Carter dropped to her knees in the middle of a dirt road in the blazing Wyoming summer. Not from exhaustion, not from grief, but because her 4-year-old son had just asked her if they were going to die. And she didn't have an answer. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button and follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end, because this one doesn't let go easy. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The day Abigail Carter decided to give her children away, the sky was the color of bleached bone. Not a cloud, not a breath of wind, just that flat, merciless Wyoming sun pressing down on everything, like it was trying to push the whole world into the earth. She had been walking since before dawn. Her boots! The good ones her husband Thomas had bought her the first winter of their marriage. Dark brown leather, barely worn because she'd been saving them. Those boots had a hole in the left sole now. She could feel every pebble, every sharp edge of baked clay through that hole. She stopped counting the miles sometime around mid-morning. Counting made it worse. Jacob rode on her back, his thin arms looped around her neck, his cheek pressed to her shoulder. He was 4 years old and he weighed almost nothing. That frightened her more than the heat. Sarah walked beside her holding the hem of Abigail's skirt in one fist. The girl was 6 and she had her father's eyes, that particular shade of gray that shifted color depending on the light. Right now those eyes were watching the road ahead with a kind of quiet focus that no child her age should have needed to develop. Neither of them had spoken for over an hour. That was when Jacob whispered it. "Mama." His voice was so dry, it barely made sound. "Are we going to die too?" Abigail stopped walking. The road stretched ahead of her, wagon rutted pale with dust, heat shimmer rising off it like something trying to escape the ground. Sweetwater Junction was still 3 miles out. She could see the rough outline of rooftops on the far edge of the flat. 3 miles. An hour, maybe more at the pace they were moving. She reached up and took Jacob's small hand in hers. His fingers were limp. "No," she said. One word. That was all she trusted herself to say. Sarah looked up at her. "Mama, I'm not scared." "I know, baby. I'm just hungry." Abigail closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She had learned to do that count to 3 behind closed eyes when the feeling came, that particular feeling that started in the center of her chest and moved outward like cracks in dry earth. If she let it reach her face, she would lose something she needed to keep. She opened her eyes. "We're almost there," she said. "Let's keep walking." 3 days since the last real meal. 2 before that, where they'd eaten maybe half of what they needed. She'd given most of it to the children, told them she wasn't hungry, told them her stomach was funny from the heat, told them whatever a mother tells her children when the truth is too heavy to put on small shoulders. Thomas had been dead for 11 months. She did not let herself think about that number often. 11 months sounded almost like a whole year, and a whole year sounded like she should have figured something out by now. She hadn't. What she had figured out was this: the drought that killed their wheat crop last summer was not going to reverse itself. The lender in Cheyenne, who held the note on their claim, was not going to extend her credit again. She'd written twice and received one reply, formal and final. The neighbors who had helped her through the first 3 months, bringing bread, helping with the fence line, checking on the children, those neighbors were fighting their own battles now. Everyone in this part of Wyoming was fighting the same drought, the same prices, the same slow grinding down that came when the land stopped giving back what you put into it. She had sold almost everything: the milk cow, the extra saddle, Thomas's good rifle that one had hurt in a way she hadn't expected, the curtains her mother had sent from Philadelphia, white cotton with small embroidered flowers. A man at the general store had given her 60 cents for those curtains, and she had thanked him and walked out and stood behind the building for 2 minutes until the feeling passed. What she had left: the clothes on their backs, a canvas bag with 2 blankets, half a jar of dried beans that she'd rationed down to nothing, and a decision she had been circling for 2 weeks. Like a dog circling a wound it couldn't stop touching. There was a woman in Sweetwater Junction, Mrs. Elaine Foss. She ran a clean boarding house on the north end of town and was known. Abigail had heard this from the preacher's wife last spring. Before things had gotten bad, she was known to take in children when circumstances required. Not an orphanage, not a charity house. A proper woman who fostered children temporarily found them situations connected them with families who were looking. Abigail had told herself for 2 weeks that she was just gathering information. She knew walking down that road with Jacob's weight on her back and Sarah's small hand gripping her skirt that she was lying to herself. She was going to Sweetwater Junction to give her children away. Not forever, she had promised herself. Just until she could find work. Just until she could save enough to get back on her feet. Just until Jacob's head dropped heavier onto her shoulder. He was falling asleep or something close to it. That scared her worse than anything else. Children didn't fall asleep in brutal midday heat on a moving back unless their bodies were telling them to conserve whatever was left. Sarah. Abigail kept her voice even. Talk to me. Tell me something. Sarah thought about it. Papa used to say that Wyoming in summer was God showing off, she said. But I don't think God is showing off today. No, Abigail agreed. Not today. Do you think Papa knows where we're going? I think your Papa knows everything about where we're going. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Despite herself, despite everything, Abigail almost smiled. It's supposed to make me feel better, she said honestly. Sarah reached up and squeezed her mother's hand once quick and firm. Then she went back to watching the road. They were still a mile out from Sweetwater Junction when Abigail heard the horse. She turned. The rider was coming from the east, moving at an easy pace, not pushing the animal in the heat. A big roan, well cared for. The rider sat straight but loose, the way men sat, who had spent more time on horseback than off it. Dark hat, trail-dusted coat, the kind of face the sun had worked on for a long time. He wasn't looking at her. That was the first thing she registered. Most men on empty roads looked at a woman traveling alone with children. Some with curiosity, some with pity, some with the particular sharpness that made a woman calculate distance and exits. This man was looking at the road ahead, and then at the sky, and then as he drew closer, he glanced toward them with the neutral assessing look of someone checking for obstacles. He slowed without being asked. Ma'am? He touched the brim of his hat. Not performed politeness, just a habit so old it happened without thought. That's a long walk in this heat. It is, Abigail said. She did not stop walking. He kept pace with her just off to the side, the horse moving in an easy walk. He looked at Jacob on her back, at the way the boy's arms hung, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not quite. Something older than pity. Boy all right? He's tired. The man nodded. He reached into his saddlebag, a slow movement, nothing sudden, and pulled out a canteen. He leaned down and held it toward her. Abigail stopped walking. She looked at the canteen, then at him. He had pale green eyes, the kind of pale that looked almost silver in strong light. There were lines at the corners of them. He was maybe 30, maybe older. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was just holding out a canteen the way you held out a canteen to someone who needed water. We're all right, she said. You don't look all right, ma'am, if you'll pardon me saying. We're almost to town. You're about a mile out. In this heat, a mile is not almost. Sarah looked up at the canteen. Her lips were cracked. Abigail had noticed that an hour ago and had been not noticing it since. Jacob stirred on her back. Mama, he said, half asleep. Mama, I'm thirsty. Abigail stood very still. There was a version of herself, the Abigail Carter, who had grown up in a proper house in Pittsburgh with a father who had opinions about charity and accepting things from strangers. That version would have kept walking. Would have held her chin up and said thank you kindly and moved on. That version of herself had been burning away for 11 months, like everything else in this drought. She reached out and took the canteen. Thank you, she said. She tipped it to Jacob's mouth first. The boy drank 3 long swallows, and then his whole body seemed to loosen, like something had been holding him tight and let go. She gave some to Sarah, who drank without taking her eyes off the rider. Then she drank herself 2 swallows, only because the canteen wasn't hers, and handed it back. "Thank you," she said again. "Name's Caleb Morgan." He took the canteen and capped it without ceremony. "I'm riding into Sweetwater. You're welcome to walk alongside." She considered him. "Abigail Carter. These are my children, Sarah and Jacob." "Mrs. Carter." Another touch of the hat. "This your first time in Sweetwater?" "No." She started walking again. He fell in beside her horse, moving quiet. "I've been in a few times, for supplies mostly. You coming from the Carter claim off the North Branch, I passed that road about 4 miles back." She glanced at him. "You know the area? I've scouted this territory for Hallbrook Ranch that's about 6 miles east of the junction. Been riding these roads for 2 seasons. He paused. "I heard things were rough on the smaller claims this year." "Things are rough everywhere this year." "Yes, ma'am. But some places rougher than others." She didn't answer that. She was watching the town ahead, the rooftops taking shape as they walked. The water had helped. She could feel it, feel her own head clearing slightly, feel the ground under her feet becoming less abstract. "What brings you into Sweetwater today?" he asked. The question was ordinary, polite, the kind of thing you asked a stranger on a road. Abigail looked at her daughter walking steady on tired legs. She looked at her son on her back, still drowsy but breathing easier. "Business," she said. Caleb Morgan nodded and didn't ask anything else. Sweetwater Junction. In summer smelled like horse dust and heated pine boards. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more permanent than they were. A feed store, a saloon that opened before noon, a land office with a painted sign she had learned to stop looking at. People noticed them. She was used to that. A widow with 2 small children walking into town on foot. No wagon, no horse. People noticed, and they catalogued. She could feel the arithmetic happening in other people's eyes as they passed. The dry goods woman sweeping her steps stopped sweeping. 2 men outside the saloon watched without bothering to pretend otherwise. Caleb Morgan walked his horse alongside her, and the crowd's attention divided and shifted the way it did when a man was present. Not eliminated, she wasn't naive, but deluded. "There's something I can help you find," he asked. "I know where I'm going." "All right." He had pulled up at the hitching post outside the general store, but he hadn't dismounted. He was watching her the way someone watched something they weren't sure about yet. Not suspicious, not intrusive, just watchful. Sarah pulled at Abigail's hand. "Mama, can we get something from the store?" "Not today, sweetheart." "Are we going to see someone?" Abigail crouched down in the street, Jacob still on her back, and looked at her daughter. Sarah's face was so serious, so much older than 6 should be. "I need to talk to a woman," Abigail said carefully. "A Mrs. Foss. I need to talk to her about some things. I need you to be very patient and very quiet while I do all right." Sarah studied her. Children, she had learned, heard everything that wasn't being said. "Are you going to cry?" Sarah asked. "No," Abigail said. And she meant it. She had already decided. Whatever happened in that conversation, she was going to hold herself together like a stone holds itself together, because if she fell apart in front of her children now, they would never forget it. "Okay," Sarah said with the gravity of someone accepting terms of negotiation. "I'll be quiet." Abigail stood. She turned. Caleb Morgan was still there. "Mrs. Foss runs the boarding house on the north end," he said quietly. "Not a question." She looked at him. He knew the town well enough to make that connection. She waited to feel embarrassed, and instead felt only tired. "Yes," she said. Something passed through his expression. "You don't have to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked away toward the far end of the street and then back at her. "How long since they've eaten properly?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not accusing, not pitying, just direct. the same way he'd offered the canteen without dressing it up in anything. 3 days, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he dismounted. He tied the roan to the hitching post and turned to face her, and she noticed he was taller than she'd registered from the ground. "There's a woman named Clara who runs the lunch counter inside the general store," he said. "She won't charge for children. She never has." Abigail shook her head. "I'm not asking for charity." "No, ma'am. I know you're not." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out some coins. He held them out. He wasn't offering them to her. He set them on the hitching post rail between them. "That's for lunch, for the children." She stared at the coins. "Mr. Morgan, I had a sister," he said, very flat, very even. 12 years ago, things went wrong. People offered to help, and she was too proud. And He stopped. He picked up the coins and held them out again, and this time he met her eyes directly. "Just let them eat, Mrs. Carter. That's all I'm asking." Abigail looked at her son, whose eyes were open now, watching the exchange with a child's uncanny alertness. She looked at her daughter. She reached out and took the coins. "I'll pay you back," she said. "That's not necessary." "I will pay you back," she said again, and her voice carried enough steel in it that he heard the difference between courtesy and intention. He nodded once. "All right. Come on," she said to her children, and she walked through the door of the general store without looking back. 4. Clara turned out to be a wide woman in her 50s, with flour on her apron and no interest in anything but getting food in front of hungry people. She took one look at Jacob and Sarah and had 2 bowls of corn chowder on the counter before Abigail had finished explaining anything. Jacob ate with both hands. Sarah ate carefully the way she did everything, watching her manners even in exhaustion, and that broke Abigail's heart more than the other way would have. Abigail ate the 3rd bowl Clara put in front of her without arguing about it. When they were done, Clara leaned on the counter and looked at her. "You thinking about seeing Elaine Foss?" Abigail looked up. "Is it that obvious? In a town this size, a woman coming in on foot with 2 small children and no bag I can add." Clara said not unkindly, "Elaine Foss is a good woman. She'll treat them right." Abigail's throat tightened. She pressed it down. "I know." "Doesn't make it easier." "No." Clara wiped down the counter. "That man who came in with you?" "He didn't come in with me. He was riding the same road." Clara looked at her with mild, undeceived eyes. "He came in right after you sat at the end of the counter, ordered coffee he hasn't touched, and has been watching that door since you sat down." Abigail turned. Through the store window she could see the street. Caleb Morgan was standing at the hitching post, not doing anything in particular, just standing. "He gave me money for lunch," she said. "I know. I saw him put it in your hand." Clara paused. "He rides for Hallbrook. Good man. Quiet. The Hallbrook boys give him some trouble because he doesn't drink with them, but he does the work of 2 men so they don't push it." She paused again. "He lost a sister. Years back. Doesn't talk about it." "He mentioned it." "Did he?" Clara seemed to find that meaningful in some way. "That's not something he mentions." Sarah had pushed her bowl away and put her head down on her arms on the counter. She was asleep in under a minute. Jacob had climbed into Abigail's lap and was half there himself, face pressed against her arm. Abigail sat very still with both her children against her, and felt the decision she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, sitting in the center of her chest like a stone. She had money for 1 night at a boarding house, maybe 2 if she was careful. After that, there was nothing. She had walked 11 miles to give her children to a stranger's care because she had run out of every other option, and now she was sitting in a store that smelled like coffee and sawdust, with both of them asleep against her, and she could not make her legs move toward the door. "Mrs. Carter." Clara's voice was gentle. "You don't have to go today." "If not today, when?" Abigail said. "Tomorrow we'll be in the same position." "That's true." Clara folded her hands on the counter. "But there's a difference between deciding when you're desperate and deciding when you've eaten something and can think straight. You just ate something. Give yourself 10 minutes to think straight." Abigail looked at her sleeping children. 10 minutes. She looked out the window. Caleb Morgan was still there, leaning against the hitching post, now hat tipped back slightly, talking to no one. Just there, like something that hadn't decided to leave yet. She looked down at Sarah's sleeping face. Her father's gray eyes closed, her small mouth slightly open. She looked at Jacob, 4 years old, and weighing almost nothing. His breath slow and even against her arm. And the stone in her chest, the decision she'd been carrying, shifted. Not gone, not decided differently, but shifted. 10 minutes, she thought. She would give herself 10 minutes. 10 minutes turned into 20. Abigail sat at that counter with both children sleeping against her and told herself she was just waiting for Jacob to wake up on his own, because waking a sleeping 4-year-old who had barely eaten in 3 days was something she couldn't bring herself to do. That was what she told herself. She was good at telling herself things. Clara refilled her coffee without asking and went back to wiping down the far end of the counter, giving her the particular kind of privacy that women in hard circumstances understood, the privacy of being left alone in a room with someone else in it. Through the window, she could still see Caleb Morgan at the hitching post. He hadn't moved, hadn't gone into the saloon, hadn't ridden off on whatever business had brought him into Sweetwater in the first place. He was just standing there in that unhurried way of his, the roan beside him, both of them looking like they had nowhere urgent to be. It irritated her slightly. She wasn't sure why. When Jacob finally stirred, blinking up at her with those dark, confused eyes children had when they woke somewhere unexpected, she smoothed his hair back and said, "Hey baby, you fell asleep." "Are we home?" he asked. The word hit her somewhere unguarded. "Not yet," she said. "We're in town." "I'm still hungry." Clara had a piece of cornbread on the counter before the sentence finished. Jacob took it without ceremony and ate half of it before he was fully awake. Sarah lifted her head, saw the bread, and sat up straight, with the focused dignity of a child who had decided she was too old to look like she wanted something, even when she wanted it badly. "There's some for you too, miss," Clara said. Sarah accepted it with a quiet thank you that was better mannered than most adults Abigail knew. "I need to settle up," Abigail said to Clara. "Already settled." She looked up. Clara nodded toward the window. Outside, Caleb Morgan was still at the post, and the understanding hit her in the chest like something cold. "He paid for the food too," Abigail said. "It wasn't a question. Came in while you were sitting with your children. Quiet about it." Clara met her eyes. "He didn't want me to tell you until you'd eaten." Abigail set down her coffee cup. She thought about Thomas, who had been proud in all the right ways. Proud about honest work, proud about paying his debts, proud about never asking for what he hadn't earned. She thought about what he would have said about this, about a stranger paying for his family's lunch. She thought about how Thomas was 11 months in the ground, and how pride was a thing that required you to be alive to maintain it. "Thank you," she said to Clara, and she lifted Jacob off her lap, took Sarah's hand, and walked outside. Caleb Morgan straightened when he saw her. He didn't say anything, just waited. Abigail stopped 2 feet from him and looked at him directly. She had learned over 11 months of negotiating with lenders and land agents and men who thought a widow was someone they could talk around, that looking people directly in the eyes was the first line of defense a woman without resources had. "You paid for the food," she said. "Clara make good chowder. Mr. Morgan." He met her eyes without flinching. "Yes, ma'am. I paid for the food. I told you I would pay you back." "You did, and I heard you." He reached up and adjusted his hat, not nervously, just something to do with his hands. "So you can pay me back when you're able. That's fine. I'm not going anywhere this afternoon." Sarah was watching him with the focused, slightly disconcerting attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. Jacob had finished his cornbread and was now leaning against Abigail's leg, watching the horse. "Can I pet him?" Jacob asked. "Jacob." "He's gentle," Caleb said. He looked at Jacob seriously, the way adults rarely looked at 4-year-olds. "His name's River. You can pet his nose if you want. He likes that." Jacob looked up at Abigail. She gave a small nod. He shuffled forward on uncertain legs and reached up toward the roan's face, and the horse lowered its head, a small, dignified accommodation, and let the boy's hand rest against its nose. Jacob's face changed completely. He had his mother's ability to keep things off his face, but this undid him, this warm, living thing bending toward him without being asked. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, high and surprised. It was the first time Abigail had heard her son laugh, and she could not remember how long. She had to look away. "Mrs. Carter." Caleb's voice was low, careful. "What are you planning to do, if you don't mind me asking?" She pulled herself straight. "That's my business, Mr. Morgan." "It is. I know that." He paused. I know Elaine Foss. She's a good woman, but she's also at capacity right now. She's got 5 children in her care already. I heard that last week from the pastor's wife." Abigail went very still. She hadn't known that. She had built the last 2 weeks around that one option, Elaine Foss, the boarding house. The children would be safe, and she could find work, and now the ground was shifting under it without warning. "That might have changed," she said. "It might have." He didn't sound convinced. "I still need to speak with her." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." He was quiet a moment. "Before you do, I want to ask you something, and you can tell me to mind my own affairs, and I will." She looked at him. "Hallbrook Ranch is 6 miles east," he said. "The owner, Mr. Hallbrook, he lost his housekeeper 2 weeks ago. Woman named Mrs. Pruitt. She left with her husband when he found work in Laramie. He's been trying to get someone out there since, but the distance puts most women off and the pay isn't what the city work offers." He said all of it without looking away from her. "It's a cabin on the property, small but solid, comes with meals and $30 a month. Children would be allowed." Abigail stared at him. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm telling you one exists. Mr. Hallbrook would need to do the offering." A beat. "But I can get you out there today if you want to talk to him, you and the children." The silence between them lasted long enough for a wagon to pass on the street behind her, long enough for Jacob to say something quiet to the horse, and the horse to breathe in response. "Why?" Abigail said. Caleb looked at her steadily. "Because I know what happens when someone runs out of options and can't find a way back. I know what that costs." He said it simply without drama. "And you've still got options, Mrs. Carter. You just don't know about all of them yet." She should have been more careful. She had been careful for 11 months, careful about who she trusted, careful about what she accepted, careful about the difference between genuine help and help that came with a cost she couldn't see yet. Every instinct she had developed since Thomas died said to be careful now. But Jacob was laughing softly at the horse. And Sarah was watching Caleb Morgan with those quiet gray eyes, and not Abigail noticed moving away from him, and Sarah moved away from things that weren't right. She always had. "I need to speak with Mrs. Foss first," Abigail said. "Of course. Whatever she tells me, I'll make my decision after that." "That's fair. And I'm not promising anything about the ranch. I'm not asking you to." She studied him for one more moment. Then she looked down at her children, Jacob still absorbed in the horse, and Sarah, who had reached over at some point and taken her mother's hand. "All right," she said. "We'll go see Mrs. Foss." Sarah. The boarding house on the north end of Sweetwater Junction was a 2-story frame building with a painted porch and window boxes that had probably had flowers in them, once before the drought took everything decorative and left only what was structural. The sign read, "Foss House Clean Rooms, Respectable Guests," in careful letters. Abigail knocked. She had told Caleb to wait at the post down the street. He'd nodded and gone without argument. She appreciated that more than she could properly express the absence of a man's presence when she needed to speak woman to woman. Elaine Foss was younger than Abigail had expected, maybe 45. Sharp, direct eyes, and the posture of someone who had made a great many decisions and stood behind all of them. "Mrs. Carter," she said after Abigail introduced herself. She looked at the children. Something moved in her face, not coldness, but a specific kind of sorrow. "Come in out of the heat." They sat in a parlor that was clean and simply furnished. Sarah sat with her hands folded. Jacob leaned against Abigail's arm and said nothing. Mrs. Foss folded her own hands. "You've come about placement," she said, not unkindly. "I've come to ask about it," Abigail said carefully. "Let me be honest with you because I think you'd rather have honesty than kindness that isn't true." Mrs. Foss held her gaze steadily. "I have 5 children in my care right now. I have room for 1 more if that child is older and self-sufficient. I have no room for 2, and I have no room for a boy Jacob's age who needs consistent care and attention." She paused. "I'm sorry." The room was very quiet. Sarah's hand found Abigail's, small fingers tightening around hers. Abigail did not look at her daughter. If she looked at her daughter right now, she would lose the 3 seconds behind closed eyes and everything past them. "I see," she said. "I can give you names," Mrs. Foss said. "There are families in Cheyenne who take children. There are church organizations. Cheyenne is 3 days by wagon." Abigail heard her own voice from somewhere slightly outside herself. "I don't have a wagon." "I know." Mrs. Foss was quiet. "I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you different." Abigail stood. Her legs were steadier than she deserved. "Thank you for your time," she said. She took Jacob's hand and held her other hand out to Sarah. "Come on, babies." They were at the door when Mrs. Foss spoke again. "Mrs. Carter, do you have somewhere to go tonight?" Abigail stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe. "I'll figure something out," she said. "There's a church on the south end, Pastor Greer. He keeps 2 rooms available for—" She paused delicately. "For families in transition. No questions asked." Abigail breathed in through her nose. Out. "Thank you," she said again. She took her children out the door and back into the blazing Wyoming sun. She made it half a block before her legs decided they were done. Not falling, she didn't fall. She sat down on the steps of a building that turned out to be a closed-up surveyor's office, and she put Jacob on her lap. And she sat there and let herself feel the full weight of the last 3 hours, the last 11 months, the last 3 years of trying to hold a life together in a place that kept pushing back. Sarah sat beside her. Didn't say anything. Just sat. That was what broke her finally. The silence of a 6-year-old girl who had learned not to ask for comfort because she'd watched her mother not have any left to give. Abigail put her arm around her daughter and pressed her face against the top of Sarah's head, and she cried. Not loudly. She had made herself a promise, and she kept it. No sounds her children would remember, but she cried hard and quiet for exactly as long as she let herself. Then she stopped. She lifted her head. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for 3 seconds. She breathed. "Mama," Jacob said. "I'm all right," she said. "You were crying." "I was. I'm done now." Jacob considered this. "Papa used to cry sometimes," he said. "When the crops didn't come up. He thought I was asleep, but I wasn't." Abigail looked at her son, 4 years old, carrying around her dead husband's hidden grief like it was something precious he was keeping safe for her. "Your papa was a good man," she said. "I know." Jacob leaned back against her. "Is the cowboy going to help us?" She looked up. 20 feet down the street, Caleb Morgan was leaning against the hitching post exactly where she'd left him. He was looking the other direction deliberately, she thought, giving her space she didn't ask for but needed. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think he will," Jacob said with the confidence of a child who had made up his mind. "He let me pet River." Sarah, who had been listening to all of this with her characteristic stillness, said, "He paid for our lunch, Mama. He did it before you could say no." Abigail looked at her daughter. "I know. Papa did that sometimes, when he knew you'd say no but you needed it anyway." The comparison landed in Abigail's chest with a weight she hadn't prepared for. She sat with it for a moment, Then she stood up, set Jacob on the ground, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward Caleb Morgan. He turned when he heard her footsteps. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him straighten off the post. "She doesn't have room," Abigail said. "I heard that might be the case. You knew before you told me to go." He didn't deny it. "I wasn't certain. I thought maybe—" He stopped. "No. You're right. I suspected." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you before." She wanted to be angry at that. She examined whether she was, and found that she was too tired and too empty to sustain it. "Why didn't you?" "Because I thought if I led with the ranch, you'd say no before you'd heard everything. And I thought you deserved to go see Foss yourself and make that determination." A beat. "I was trying to handle it in the right order and I handled it wrong. I apologize." The honesty was unexpected enough to disarm her. Men who apologized without caveat, without the but or the to be fair or the I was only trying to were rare in her experience. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. Something in his shoulders released. "Hallbrook's a fair man. Runs about 300 head. Crew of 8 hands. You'd be cooking 3 meals a day and keeping the main house that's for Mr. Hallbrook and whoever's working inside. Laundry twice a week. The cabin's 1 room, but it's proper built, got a stove and 2 windows. You'd have it to yourselves." He paused. "The work is hard. I won't tell you it isn't." "I'm not afraid of hard work." "No, I don't expect you are." $30 a month, she said. "That's what Mrs. Pruitt got. I can't speak to whether Hallbrook would negotiate." She thought about it. $30 a month was real money. More than she'd seen in 6 months on the claim. A cabin. A stove. 3 meals a day, and that last part mattered most because 3 meals a day meant her children would eat. "Who are the hands?" she said. "What kind of men?" "Working men. A couple are rough around the edges. None of them are dangerous." He said it plainly. "I wouldn't be telling you to bring your children somewhere that wasn't safe." Sarah had drifted close enough to hear most of this. She looked up at Caleb Morgan. "Do you live there too?" she asked. "Sarah," Abigail started. "It's a fair question," he said. He looked at Sarah directly. "I ride for Hallbrook. I don't live at the main ranch, I'm on the trail a lot. But I'm in and out." Sarah nodded, processing this. "Do they have other children there?" "No, miss, just men and horses." "Jacob likes horses," she said seriously. "I noticed that." He looked at the boy who was currently examining a crack in the boardwalk with intense focus. "I think River likes him too, for what that's worth." Abigail looked at her daughter, who was conducting an interview with a grown man on her behalf with all the gravity of a circuit judge. She almost said something. Instead, she let it run. "Would our mother have her own space?" Sarah asked. "Or would she have to be around the men all the time?" Caleb blinked. It was the first time she'd seen anything catch him off guard. "She'd have the cabin," he said carefully. "And the kitchen. The men eat in the cookhouse. It's separate." "Okay," Sarah said. She looked up at her mother. "I think we should go." "Sarah, you asked me to be quiet, and I was. Now I'm telling you what I think." The girl lifted her chin. She looked so much like Thomas in that moment that it stopped the breath in Abigail's chest. "We need to eat every day, Mama, and Jacob needs somewhere to sleep that isn't the ground. We should go to the ranch." The street was quiet around them. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. The roan shifted its weight. Abigail looked at Caleb Morgan. He said nothing. He waited. He understood she thought that this decision belonged to her entirely, and the most useful thing he could do was not push it. "If we go," she said, "and Hallbrook doesn't want us, we come back to town. No argument." "That's fair." "And if I take the job, it's a trial, 1 month. I decide after a month if it's right." "Also fair. You'd want to say that to Hallbrook himself." "I intend to." She squared her shoulders. "And, Mr. Morgan, I'll pay back the lunch money, every cent." He nodded. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "I believe you will, Mrs. Carter." She turned to her children. "Jacob, come here." Jacob looked up from the crack in the boardwalk. "Are we going somewhere?" "We're going to a ranch," she said. She crouched down to his level and looked him in the eyes. "It's going to be a long ride, and when we get there, you're going to be polite and quiet like your sister. Can you do that?" He thought about it with the laborious seriousness of someone being asked something genuinely difficult. "Can I see River?" She glanced up at Caleb. He nodded. "Yes," she said. "You can see River." Jacob straightened. "Okay," he said. "I can be quiet." She had not been on horseback since the autumn before Thomas died. She had forgotten, or perhaps simply stopped letting herself remember what it felt like to move through the Wyoming landscape at that height and speed. The way the land opened up, the way the horizon shifted and gave back, the way the heat was different when you were moving through it instead of standing in it. Caleb had settled Jacob in front of him on the saddle without making a performance of it. Just asked Abigail if that would be all right, then reached down and lifted the boy up in one easy motion. Jacob had grabbed the saddle horn with both hands and gone rigid with the particular excitement of a child, trying very hard not to show how excited he was. Abigail walked with Sarah. She had refused the offer of carrying them both. It was too much weight for the horse in this heat, and she wasn't so far gone that she couldn't walk 6 miles. She was tired, but the water and the chowder had put something back into her, and the decision had put something back too. The specific steadiness that came from having chosen a direction, even an uncertain one. Sarah walked beside her and said almost nothing for the first 2 miles, which was fine. Then she said, "Mama, what if he's not a good man?" Abigail had been thinking about exactly that. "Then we leave," she said. "How will we know?" "We'll know." She had learned to trust that over the years, not blind faith in judgment, but faith in the evidence that people gave about themselves when they didn't think you were watching. Caleb Morgan had not thought she was watching when he paid for the food. He hadn't known Clara would tell her. "People show you who they are, baby. You just have to watch." "I've been watching," Sarah said. "I know you have." "He talks to Jacob like Jacob's a real person." Abigail looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Some grown-ups talk to Jacob like he's furniture, like they're saying words at him, but they don't expect him to have any back." Sarah watched the road ahead. "He doesn't do that. He told Jacob Rivers' name. He looked at him when he answered my question." She paused. "Papa did that too." Abigail kept walking and didn't say anything for a long moment. "You're very observant," she finally said. "Papa said that too." Sarah glanced up at her. "He said I got it from you." Ahead of them she could hear Jacob saying something to Caleb, the words lost with the distance, and she could hear Caleb responding low, even not talking down, and not performing. Just talking. She kept walking. The ranch came into view as the sun started its long, angled descent toward evening, still blazing, still fierce, but shifted enough that the light went gold rather than white. A cluster of buildings, a fence line the shapes of cattle in a distant field. Something that had been wound tight inside her loosened the smallest fraction. Not hope. She wasn't ready to call it hope, but the absence briefly of the worst of the fear. That was enough for now. Jacob turned on the horse and shouted back at her, "Mama, I can see it. There's horses in the fence." Sarah looked up at her mother. "Are you scared?" she asked. Abigail thought about lying. Then she looked at this daughter who read adults like weather patterns and decided against it. "Yes," she said, "a little." "Me too," Sarah said. Then she reached up and took her mother's hand. "But I think it's going to be all right." Abigail held her daughter's hand and walked toward the ranch and didn't let herself think past the next step. One step, then the next. That was how you kept moving when you didn't know what you were walking into. You just kept walking. Hallbrook Ranch did not announce itself as anything special. That was the first thing Abigail noticed when they came through the gate. No pretension, no attempt at impression. Just working structures built for function, maintained with enough care that nothing was falling down, but nothing was decorative either. The kind of place that had been shaped entirely by what it needed to be, rather than what anyone wanted it to look like. Caleb swung down from the horse and lifted Jacob to the ground before Abigail had even reached the gate. Jacob landed on his feet, looked around at the corrals and the cattle shapes in the distance, and said, "Oh!" in a voice that held more awe than most adults could access. A man came out of the main house before they'd made it 3 steps into the yard. He was in his 60s, lean, with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned long ago that hurry cost more than it saved. He looked at Caleb first, then at Abigail, then at the children, and he did all of this without his expression committing to anything. "Morgan," he said. "Mr. Holbrook." Caleb gestured toward Abigail. "This is Mrs. Carter. She's heard about the housekeeper position. She's interested in speaking with you about it." Holbrook's eyes moved to Abigail. She met them directly. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Holbrook." She didn't offer more than that. She had found in the year since Thomas died that men like this men who had built something and were cautious about who they let near it responded better to stillness than to selling. He looked at the children again. Sarah stood straight. Jacob had edged half a step behind his mother, but was looking at Holbrook with wide, evaluating eyes. "How old?" Holbrook said. "Sarah is 6. Jacob is 4. "They healthy?" She kept her voice even. "They're tired, and they've had a hard few days. They're healthy." He studied her for another moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "You vouch for her." The question surprised her, not that he asked it, but the weight behind it. As if Caleb's answer actually mattered to him, as if it would settle something. Caleb didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir, I do." Holbrook nodded short and final. "Come inside," he said to Abigail. "We'll talk terms. Morgan, see to your horse." Yeah. The conversation with Holbrook lasted 20 minutes. He was direct in the way of men who had no patience for indirection, and Abigail matched him exactly. He laid out what he needed: cooking, cleaning, laundry, organization of the dry goods store, occasional help when the crew needed supplies packed for trail. She laid out her conditions: the cabin, the children present, and not interfered with. Sundays kept clear after noon. $32 a month rather than 30, because she had asked Clara, and Clara had confirmed that was the going rate in Laramie for equivalent work. Holbrook looked at her when she said 32. "Mrs. Pruitt took 30, he said. "I'm aware. I'm not Mrs. Pruitt." She held his gaze. "You need someone who will stay. I need somewhere to stay. 32 is fair, and we both know it." Something moved in the old man's face that was either respect or annoyance, or possibly both. 31, he said. 32, she said. A beat. Fine, he said. He put out his hand. She shook it. When she came back out, Caleb was at the water trough seeing to the roan. He looked up. "Well," he said. 32 a month, she said. "Starting tomorrow." He nodded, the not quite smile again. He tried 30. He tried 30. "And you?" 32, she said. This time he did smile, brief and real, and slightly startled, like it arrived before he'd decided to allow it. He looked back at the horse. "I'll show you the cabin," he said. The cabin was small, but Caleb had not lied. It was solid. One room, a stove, 2 windows that let the evening light through. A narrow bed frame with no mattress, a table, 2 chairs. Nothing extra, nothing missing. Jacob walked in, turned around once, and said, "It's bigger than our old house." It was not bigger than their old house. "It's just right," Abigail said. Sarah ran her hand along the wall. "Is it ours?" she asked. "While we're here." "Just ours, nobody else's. Just ours." Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing this with the gravity she brought to all facts. Then she went to one of the windows and looked out, her gray eyes moving over whatever she saw there. The yard, the evening sky, the working shapes of the ranch, and she said nothing more. But her shoulders came down from where they'd been living somewhere up near her ears for longer than Abigail had noticed. Caleb had stayed in the doorway. "I can get a mattress from the bunkhouse storeroom," he said. "There's a spare, and blankets." "We have blankets," Abigail said. "You have two. 3 people need more than that." He said it without apology. "I'll get the mattress." He went. She didn't argue. She was learning faster than she might have under other circumstances the specific rhythm of how Caleb Morgan helped. He didn't ask. He didn't wait to be thanked. He identified what was needed, and he went and did it, and the only tell that it meant something to him was the care he took in the doing. She started thinking about Thomas less and less when she looked at him. She was not sure how to feel about that. The first week at Hallbrook Ranch established a pattern before Abigail had consciously designed one. She was up before 5 fires started in the main house kitchen. Biscuits in before the crew came in at past. There were 8 hands. She learned their names by the 3rd morning, their preferences by the 5th, their temperaments by the end of the week. Most of them were straightforward. 2 were younger men, who had the swagger of boys who'd never had a woman in the kitchen before, and weren't sure what to do with one. She managed them the same way she'd managed everything difficult in her life, by being so competent, so consistently, that the question of whether she should be there stopped being interesting. The crew's name for her by the end of the first week was Mrs. Carter, said with the particular inflection that meant they'd decided she was all right. Jacob discovered the horses on day 2 and made it his personal project to know all of them by name. One of the older hands, a quiet man named Pete, with a gray beard and slow speech, started leaving the corral gate unlatched in the mornings, which Jacob understood as an invitation. By day 4, he was in the corral every morning after breakfast, Pete somewhere nearby pretending to do something else. Sarah found the supply ledger on the 3rd day. She'd been helping Abigail organize the dry goods storeroom when she discovered that the records were 3 months behind and cross-referenced wrong. She brought this to Abigail's attention with the focused alarm of someone who had found a structural problem that could not be ignored. "I know," Abigail said. "I'm going to fix it." "I can help," Sarah said. "You're 6. I can add." A pause. "Papa taught me." Abigail had looked at her daughter for a long moment. "All right," she had said. "Pull up that stool." By the end of the first week, the ledger was current. Hallbrook noticed. He said nothing about it to Abigail directly, but she heard him tell one of the hands that the supplies were running $1.40 under projection for the week, and she saw him look at the storeroom door with an expression that suggested he understood why. She had been right about 32. Caleb came and went. That was the nature of his work 2 days at the ranch, then out on the trail for 3 back for a day out again. She built her sense of his schedule from the gaps rather than the presence, which she recognized as a dangerous kind of attention, and noted and did not stop. On the evenings he was there, he ate in the cookhouse with the crew. But he had a habit of coming around to the cabin afterward, never inside, always the doorstep to ask if there was anything needed. The first 2 times she'd said no, and meant it. The 3rd time Jacob had been running a low fever, and she'd said without thinking, "Do you know if there's willow bark in the stores?" And he'd gone and found it, and come back, and handed it to her without any expression that made her feel she'd revealed too much by asking. The fever broke by morning. She never mentioned it to him. He never brought it up. But the next time he came back from the trail, he had a second blanket folded and set outside the cabin door without announcement. She picked it up and held it, and stood there in the early morning air for longer than she should have. Then she put it inside and went to start the biscuits. It was on the 11th day that the first real trouble arrived. She had been aware of it building the way weather builds pressure, changing before the clouds come. 2 of the younger hands, Vance and a boy called Derry, had started eating slower in the mornings. Not because the food was bad, because they'd decided to test something. She'd felt it, the lingering, the comments timed to when no one else was nearby, the particular register of attention that meant a woman was being evaluated for something that had nothing to do with her work. She'd handled worse. She'd been handling it quietly, efficiently, the way she handled everything. But on the 11th morning, Vance came into the kitchen while she was alone and leaned against the doorframe in a way that blocked the exit and said, "You know you don't have to work this hard, Mrs. Carter. There are easier ways for a woman like you to get by out here." Abigail set down the bowl she was holding. She turned and looked at him. "Move out of my doorway," she said. "I'm just saying." "I heard what you said." Her voice was flat and absolute. "Move out of my doorway, or I will go to Mr. Holbrook in the next 5 minutes and describe this conversation in detail. And you can decide whether your job is worth more to you than whatever you were about to say next." Vance stared at her. She stared back. She had nothing behind her eyes in that moment except clarity. He moved. She picked up the bowl and went back to her biscuits, and did not let her hands shake until she heard the cookhouse door close behind him. She didn't go to Holbrook. She wouldn't unless it happened again. Men like Vance were cowards, and the threat had been enough. But she spent the rest of the morning with one ear cocked, aware of every footstep, aware of where Sarah was, aware of where Jacob was. That was the morning she realized that the ranch was safer than the road, but it was not safe in the way that her old life had been safe when Thomas was alive, and she was a woman with a man beside her, and most of the world's particular dangers had not applied. She was thinking about this standing at the kitchen window after the lunch dishes were done, watching Jacob in the corral with Pete when she heard steps on the porch. Not Vance. Different weight, different pace. Caleb Morgan opened the kitchen door without knocking. He never knocked. She'd noticed at the kitchen, which was a working space, though he always knocked at the cabin, and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She turned back to the window. "Nothing I couldn't handle." "Mrs. Carter?" "It was handled." She picked up a dish and dried it. "I'm fine." A beat of silence. Then, "Was it Vance?" She looked at him. "Why would you say that?" "Because I've watched him for 3 days, and I've watched you notice, and I've watched you handle it without saying anything." He said it quietly, not accusing, just laying facts. "And this morning you look like you've been holding something very still for a few hours." She set the dish down. "He made a suggestion," she said. "I declined clearly. It's over." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "Did he threaten you?" "No, he was ugly. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. He looked at the table. Then he said, "I should have said something to him sooner. I saw it coming and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you'd handle it." "I did handle it." "I know." He met her eyes. "That's not the point." She looked at him, waiting. "The point is that you shouldn't have had to handle it alone," he said. "And I knew something was building, and I waited to see if I was wrong instead of dealing with it. That was wrong of me." The honesty of it landed in the same place his apology in town had landed that particular unguarded directness that she couldn't find a way to defend against, because it didn't attack anything. "I've been handling things alone for a year," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "Doesn't mean you always have to." The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear Jacob's voice from the corral saying something to Pete and Pete's low response. "I'll talk to Vance," he said. "And to Holbrook if you want." "Talking to Vance is enough." She picked up another dish. "But yes, thank you." He nodded once and left. That evening she watched from the cabin window as Caleb walked into the cookhouse. She didn't hear what was said, but Vance came out 10 minutes later and went directly to the bunkhouse without looking in her direction, and he didn't look at her directly for the rest of the week. On the 14th night the storm came. It had been building since afternoon, that green-edged darkness in the western sky that everyone in Wyoming recognized. Not a drought breaker. A mean summer storm, the kind that brought lightning and wind and a rain so hard and sideways it found every gap in every structure. By the time it hit the ranch fully, Jacob was awake and trembling, not crying. He'd stopped crying at loud things sometime in the months after Thomas died, which she thought was worse than if he'd cried. He just went silent and rigid, which was what fear looked like when a child had decided that making noise during fear hadn't helped enough times. "I've got you," Abigail said. She pulled him against her. It's just weather. It's loud, he said into her shoulder. I know. Sarah was awake too, sitting up in the blankets with her knees pulled to her chest. She wasn't scared of storms. She was scared of Jacob being scared, which was different, and in Abigail's opinion, more mature a fear than most adults managed. Tell him the thing, Sarah said to her mother. The thing Papa used to say. Abigail held Jacob tighter. When the sky gets loud, she said quietly against his hair, it's just the mountains talking to each other. They only shout because they're too far apart to hear. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Papa said the mountains were friends, he said. They are. Friends shout when they haven't seen each other in a while. Thunder cracked directly above them, enormous and immediate. The lantern on the table guttered and went out. Jacob made a sound she hadn't heard from him in months. Small and broken and entirely 4 years old. A knock at the cabin door. Hard and fast 3 times. She was on her feet before she knew she'd moved Jacob against her hip, and she opened the door, and it was Caleb, rain-soaked through in under a minute from crossing the yard holding a second lantern that was somehow still lit. Roof's solid, he said immediately, reading her face. You're not in danger. I just... He stopped. He was looking at Jacob's face. I came to check. We're all right, she said. Jacob, without warning, reached out toward Caleb. Not words. Just reached. It was the kind of gesture children made before they thought about it, pure need, no calculation. The gesture of someone who has identified a safe thing and moved toward it without asking permission. Abigail felt something shift so fundamentally in her chest that she couldn't immediately name it. Caleb took Jacob without hesitation. He just stepped inside out of the doorway and the rain, and took the boy and held him the way you held a child, one arm under him, one against his back, like he'd done it 1,000 times. Hey, he said to Jacob, you hear that thunder, big one? It's really loud, Jacob said into his shoulder. It is. You know why it's loud. Mama says the mountains are talking. Your mama's right. He looked at Sarah over Jacob's head. You okay, miss? I'm fine, Sarah said with the particular dignity of a 6-year-old who wanted everyone to know she was not frightened. Jacob doesn't like storms. Lot of people don't. He said it without diminishment, which Sarah seemed to approve of. I didn't used to when I was small. Jacob lifted his head. You were scared of storms. Terrified, Caleb said, completely matter-of-fact. Used to hide under my bed until I was about 7. My sister used to sit on top of the bed and tell me stories so I could hear her voice. Helped more than anything else. Abigail was watching him. He was talking to her son, and he was telling the truth. She could hear the truth in it, the specificity of it, the way he said my sister, with a weight underneath the words that he didn't try to hide. What's your sister's name? Jacob asked. A pause. Emma, he said. Her name was Emma. Was. Past tense. She'd heard it from Clara. She heard it again now in the specific way he held very still after saying it. Jacob heard the weight in it too, even at 4, because he put his small hand on the side of Caleb's face. The unself-conscious comfort of a child who didn't know any other way to say I heard that and said, I'm sorry about Emma. The storm was still howling outside, rain driving against the window, lightning making the room go white every few minutes. And Caleb Morgan held her son in the middle of the small cabin and looked like a man who had just had something happen to him that he hadn't braced for. Thank you, he said to Jacob, very quiet. She would have liked you a lot. Sarah had slid off the bed and come to stand next to Abigail without any announcement. She took her mother's hand. Abigail looked down at her. Sarah was watching Caleb with her father's eyes, and whatever evaluation had been running since Sweetwater Junction was Abigail could see reaching some kind of conclusion. The storm ran itself out in about an hour. By the time it passed, Jacob was asleep against Caleb's shoulder. The lantern was back on the table, and the 4 of them had spent an hour in the close interior of the cabin in a way that had rearranged something Abigail couldn't have said precisely what or precisely how, but something had moved, When Jacob was asleep enough to transfer, Caleb laid him on the mattress with a care that she watched from across the room. He tucked his blanket, the one he'd left outside the door, around the boy's shoulders. He straightened. He looked at Abigail. She should have said something ordinary. "Good night, thank you, we're fine now." Any of those would have been appropriate. What she said was, "Tell me about Emma." He looked at her for a long moment. Sarah had climbed back into the bed and was nearly asleep, or near enough. The room was very still. Caleb pulled out one of the chairs from the table and sat down. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the lantern. "She was 7 years younger than me," he said. "This was in Tennessee, 48-49. Dad was sick. I was working the farm mostly alone. Emma was 13 when it got bad drought, and then a cold winter, and then a blight on the second planting." He paused. "She was hungry for a long time. I was sending most of what we had to her and my mother, and working extra for a neighbor, thinking I could bridge the gap." He stopped again. "I thought I had more time to find a solution. I was looking for a way to fix it without asking for help, because asking for help meant admitting it was as bad as it was." He looked up. "Emma died in the February. Fever on top of everything else. Doctor said if she'd had proper food the previous 2 months, she would have fought it off." The quiet sat between them like something solid. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. "I could have gone to the church," he said. "I could have gone to the neighbors. There was help available, and I thought it was weakness. I thought if I asked for help, it meant I'd failed her." He met her eyes. "By the time I understood the difference between weakness and asking for help, it was too late to matter." Abigail sat with that, all of it, the shape of it. "That's why you paid for the food," she said, "in Sweetwater." "That's why I paid for the food." He said it plainly. "And that's why I didn't want you to say no." She looked at her children, Jacob sleeping one arm out of the blanket. Sarah almost there, her breathing slowed and deep. She thought about the road into Sweetwater, her son asking if they were going to die. The decision she'd been carrying about Elaine Foss. She thought about all the months she'd spent telling herself she could bridge the gap, find the solution, get through it alone. "I almost waited too long," she said quietly. Not to him exactly, to the room, to herself. "But you didn't," he said. She looked at him. "You were walking into town," he said. "You were doing something about it, even when it was the hardest thing you'd ever done. You didn't stop." Something in his voice was careful, and also underneath the careful not. "Emma stopped. She stopped telling me how bad it was because she didn't want to add to my worry. She protected me right up until she couldn't anymore." A pause. "You're not protecting yourself the same way. You're protecting your children differently." She didn't have anything to say to that. The distinction he was making was real, and she felt it, and she didn't know what to do with it. After a long moment, she said, "How long have you been carrying that?" "Emma's been dead 14 years, he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. The lantern between them. The storm gone, the quiet coming in behind it. "Every day," he said. "Some days heavier than others." She nodded slowly. She understood that arithmetic. She lived it in different numbers. "Does it get lighter?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. She appreciated that he didn't answer quickly, that he took the question seriously. "It changes shape," he said finally. "That's the best I can say. It gets a different shape, and you get better at carrying the shape it becomes." A pause. "Having something to do helps. Having somewhere to be." She looked at him sitting in her borrowed chair in her borrowed cabin. Rain dripping from the eaves outside, both her children sleeping 10 feet away. "Why are you still here?" she said. "At this ranch. A man with your skills could find work anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking I'm about to leave," he said. "Then something comes up that needs doing. Then something else." He didn't look away from her. "I've been thinking about leaving for about 2 weeks now." She held his gaze, understood what he was and wasn't saying. "Mr. Morgan," she said carefully, "you don't have to." he started. "I'm not ready," she said. Simply, clearly, not unkindly. "I don't know if I'll get to ready, and I think you should know that before you stop thinking about leaving." He nodded. He took that exactly as she'd given it, no negotiation, no persuasion. "All right," he said. "But I'm grateful," she said, "for all of it. I want you to know that. I do know that, and I trust you." She said it like the significant thing it was. "That's not something I'm giving away easily. I want you to know that too." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was open in a way she suspected it wasn't often open. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't take it lightly." She stood. He stood. The natural end of the conversation reached without either of them having to name it. "Good night, Mr. Morgan," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Carter." He picked up the lantern he'd brought, left hers, and went to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. If Jacob's scared tomorrow night and there's residual thunder, it sometimes rolls through the day. After tell him the mountains are finishing the last of what they had to say. Emma and I used to tell each other that. She stood in the doorway as he crossed the dark yard back toward the bunkhouse, lantern swinging, and something in her chest did something she hadn't felt in 11 months. Not joy. Not yet. Something quieter than joy, and in some ways more dangerous. The beginning of the willingness to feel something again. She closed the cabin door softly and went to pull the blanket back over Jacob's shoulder and stood there for a long time in the dark, listening to her children breathe before she finally lay down and let herself sleep. The morning after the storm, Abigail woke before the birds. She lay still for a moment listening, both children breathing. The ranch settling after the night's violence, timbers still drying out, the kind of quiet that followed big weather. She had actually slept deep, and without the fractured half-waking she'd grown used to in the last year. And she noticed that the way you notice something you hadn't realized you'd been missing. She got up, started the stove, and went to work. That was what she did with things that felt too large to examine directly. She worked. By the time the crew came in for breakfast, she had biscuits, fried salt pork, and a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Vance came in last and sat at the far end of the table without looking at her. She put food in front of him, the same as everyone else. That was the only answer she intended to give to that particular situation. Absolute, unbending normalcy, which was its own kind of message. Pete came in, glanced at Jacob, still asleep on the mattress, visible through the open cabin door across the yard, and said, "Boy, weathered the storm all right." "He did fine," Abigail said. "Good kid," Pete said, and sat down and ate, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Caleb was not at breakfast. She noticed. She was not going to make anything of noticing. She put it in the same category as the blanket outside the door and the willow bark, and the way he'd taken Jacob without hesitation. She put all of it in a category labeled things that are true and carried on. He rode in at mid-morning from the direction of the north pasture horse, dusty, checking fence line that the storm had likely tested. He came to the kitchen door, knocked, always knocked at the kitchen since she'd said it was a working space, and now she'd stopped thinking of that as a working space and started thinking of it as hers, and she handed him coffee without asking if he wanted it. He took it without making anything of that either. "Fence held," he said. "Good. 3 sections of it are going to need work before the next storm. I told Hallbrook." He drank the coffee. She rolled out the dough for the noon meal. This was what the 2 weeks had built between them, a kind of parallel comfort, the ability to occupy the same space without filling it with words. She had not had that with anyone since Thomas, and she was aware of that fact, and not ready to say so, and she thought he understood that, and was patient with it in the same way he was patient with everything. Not performing patience, just genuinely possessing it. "Jacob wants to learn to ride," she said. Caleb set his cup down. Pete mentioned, "I told him he had to ask me first." "Did he ask you?" "He asked me approximately 40 times between waking up and breakfast." She kept rolling the dough. "I told him if he could name all the horses in the corral correctly, I'd think about it." "He can already name all the horses in the corral." She looked up. "I know," she said. I'm thinking about it. The corner of his mouth. She'd stopped trying not to notice that. I can put him on River, he said. River's gentle. I'd hold the lead line. I'll watch. Of course. She went back to the dough. He stood in the doorway a moment more in no hurry, and then said, You slept last night. She paused, then kept rolling. How would you know that? Because you don't look like you've been awake since 4 a.m. You look like someone who slept until 5. She said nothing. It's a good thing, Mrs. Carter, he said. That's all I meant. I know what you meant, she said. And then because he'd said simple, true things to her, and she owed him the same, first time in, I don't know how long, proper sleep. He nodded. She heard the quiet satisfaction in the silence he gave her after it, and that too went into the category of things that were true. On the 18th day, Holbrook called her into the main house. She wiped her hands on her apron and went running through the mental inventory of what she might have done wrong. The ledger, the supply order, something with the crew, and found nothing she could identify. She had learned to keep that kind of internal accounting because surprises were usually costs in disguise. Holbrook was at his desk. He had a letter in front of him. He looked up when she came in. Sit down, Mrs. Carter. She sat. She watched his face. He was not angry. He was something else. The particular expression of a man working out how to say something he hadn't decided he wanted to say. I've had a letter from my son, he said. She waited. He's been in Denver. He's coming back. Holbrook put the letter down. He's bringing a wife. Abigail looked at him steadily. I see. His wife, she keeps her own house, her way. He said it carefully, which told her everything about the wife that the words didn't. She's already written to say she'll be handling the domestic arrangements. The word domestic arrangements landed like a stone in still water. 22 days. She had been here 22 days. She had the ledger current, the cabin warm, the crew fed, $31 coming at the end of the month. 32. She corrected herself because she had held the line, and Holbrook had agreed, and now she sat across from an old man who was telling her in the gentlest terms he had available that she might need to find somewhere else to be. When? She said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 8. She writes slow. He paused. I'm not ending your employment, Mrs. Carter. I want to be clear on that. But when Margaret arrives, the arrangements will change. Whether there's still a position that will depend on her. Abigail sat with it. 6 weeks. 8 if she was lucky. Enough time to save most of 2 months' wages if she was careful, $64. Enough to do something with. More than she'd had when she walked into Sweetwater Junction. Not enough to feel safe. Thank you for telling me directly, she said. You deserve that much. He looked at her for a moment. You're the best housekeeper I've had. Mrs. Pruitt was thorough. You're thorough, and you think ahead. That's a different thing. He said it like a statement of fact, which she supposed it was. I'm sorry the timing is what it is. She stood. She smoothed her apron. I'll keep doing the work until I know different, she said. I know you will. He paused. Morgan knows this ranch and the territory better than anyone. If you need to think about options, he'd be a useful person to talk to. She nodded once and walked out. Ted. She did not tell the children. There was no reason to tell them yet. It would only introduce fear into something that had just stopped being frightening. And they had earned the right to stop being frightened for a little while. Jacob had started eating properly, had color back in his face, had stopped feeling like something too light when she lifted him. Sarah had a corner of the cabin she'd made her own, her small stack of things, arranged with the precision of someone who had learned to occupy space carefully. She was sleeping through the night. Abigail would not take that from them 1 hour before she had to. She carried it herself instead. Added it to the weight she already knew how to carry, adjusted her balance, and kept moving. She told Caleb that evening. He was at the corral fence, checking the latch. Pete had apparently still been forgetting on purpose when she came out after the children were settled. He turned when he heard her steps and looked at her face, and didn't ask, just waited. Holbrook's son is coming, she said. With a wife, 6 weeks, maybe 8. Caleb went still. "Margaret," he said. It wasn't a question. "You know her." "I know of her." He turned back to the fence latch, worked it in his hand, not looking at her. "She ran the household in Denver with a full staff, and she has opinions about how things should be done." A pause. "She won't want a widow with 2 children in the cabin." The plainness of it would have flattened her 2 weeks ago. Now she received it as information. "That's what I thought." He set the latch, turned around, and leaned against the fence. He was quiet for a moment. The productive kind of quiet she'd learned meant he was actually thinking, not stalling. "There's a woman in Sweetwater," he said. "Mrs. Aldrich. She runs the millinery, but she's been trying to expand into dry goods for 2 years. She can't get the supply lines organized, she doesn't have someone who can manage inventory, and she knows it. I've heard her say it twice in the last month." Abigail looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about options." He met her eyes. "Since before Holbrook told you. The situation with Margaret, it was always a possibility. I should have told you sooner." "You didn't know about the letter?" "No. But I knew his son was due back this year." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry. I should have said something." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Stop apologizing for things and just tell me what you're thinking." Something shifted in his face, surprised again by her directness. Then something easier, like a door opening. "Aldrich needs a manager for the dry goods expansion," he said. "It's town work, not ranch work. Better long-term. She's got a room above the shop she's been using for storage. It's not a cabin, but it's a real building with a real floor, and she's been trying to figure out what to do with it." "You're saying she might let us live there?" "I'm saying it's worth asking." He paused. "She's a fair woman. She won't offer out of charity, she'll offer if she thinks it's a good business arrangement, which it would be. You've already proven you can manage inventory." He said it simply. The ledger didn't fix itself. She almost smiled at that, stopped herself. "You've been doing a lot of thinking on my behalf, Mr. Morgan. Is that a problem?" She considered. "It depends on why." He looked at her. The evening light was doing something to the sky behind him. She was not going to think about the sky. She was thinking about him, about this man who had appeared on a road and had not left, who had paid for her children's lunch and found willow bark and held her son in a storm and had been quietly, methodically building escape routes for her situation before she even knew she needed them. "Why?" she said again, quieter this time. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been riding this territory for 2 years, he said. "Doing good work and moving on. That was the plan. There wasn't a plan exactly, but that was the shape of it. Keep moving, don't settle." He looked at the fence, then back at her. "And then I came down a road in the heat, and there was a woman with 2 kids and a hole in her boot. And I have not once, since that day, thought about moving on without the next thought being what happens to them." She stood very still. "I'm not saying that to pressure you," he said. "You told me you weren't ready, and I heard that, and I mean it when I say I heard it. I'm just—" He stopped. "I'm just being honest with you. You've asked me to be honest." She had. She had asked him for honesty, and he was giving it to her, and she needed to receive it honestly in return. "I think about you too," she said. The words were careful and exact. "I want you to know that. It's not nothing." She held his gaze. "But I buried my husband 11 months ago, and I've been trying to survive since the day after the funeral, and I don't fully know yet who I am without that, without the surviving. I don't know what I have left when the emergency is over. I need to find that out." He nodded, slow and real. "That's a fair thing to need to know," he said. "It's not a no," she said. "I want to be clear. I understand the difference." "Do you?" "Yes." He held her eyes. "I can wait." The simplicity of it. No bargaining, no conditions, no performance of sacrifice. Just "I can wait," said the way you stated a fact about yourself that you were certain of. She breathed out. "Tell me more about Mrs. Aldrich," she said. And the tension in the air shifted, not gone. Nothing between them was going to simply go away, but settled into something they could both stand on. He talked. She listened. They stood at that fence until the sky went full dark, and she needed to go check the children, and when she turned to go, he said her name. "Mrs. Carter." She turned back. "Abigail," he said. Not pushing, just trying it, testing whether she'd allow it. She let it land, let herself hear it. It had been 11 months since someone said her name like that, like it was something specific, not a title. "Good night, Caleb," she said, and she went inside. The next morning something had changed in the crew without Abigail having done anything. She became aware of it gradually, the way Pete held the cookhouse door for her, the way two of the other hands started bringing their plates to the kitchen window, rather than leaving them at the table, the way Derry Vance's shadow started saying thank you at meals. Not performance. Genuine behavior shift, the kind that meant the existing culture had decided something and adjusted. She realized between the noon dishes and the start of the afternoon baking that Caleb had talked to more than just Vance. She wasn't sure when. She wasn't sure what he'd said. She did not ask. She let the changed behavior exist without examining its origin too closely, because examining it would have required acknowledging the degree to which it mattered to her, and she was not ready to examine that either. Sarah noticed. Of course she did. "The men are nicer," she said matter-of-factly one afternoon while she was helping Abigail sort dried beans. "Did something happen?" "Nothing I know of specifically," Abigail said, which was true in the technical sense. Sarah looked at her with her father's eyes. "Caleb talked to them," she said. "Not a question." "Why would you think that?" "Because things change when Caleb does something about them." Sarah picked through the beans with steady, small hands. "He fixed the fence after I mentioned Jacob got his foot caught in the lower rail. He got Pete to clean up by the corral gate after I said Jacob almost stepped on something rusty." She paused. "I didn't tell him to. He just heard me say it and fixed it." Abigail stared at her daughter. "When did you tell him those things?" "In the mornings when he's at the corral." Sarah didn't look up from the beans. "We talk sometimes." "What do you talk about?" "Things. A beat. Jacob mostly. What Jacob needs. He asks good questions." Another pause. "He asked me once what the most important thing was that would help you." She glanced up. "I said for you to not be scared anymore." He didn't say anything, but he looked like he'd remember it. Abigail sat with a bean in her hand and could not speak for a moment. "Sarah?" she finally said. "I know," Sarah said. "I should have told you." "That's not—" Abigail set the bean down. "It's not that. I just—" She looked at her daughter. "What else did you tell him?" "I told him Papa used to fix things too," Sarah said simply, without being asked. "I told him that's how we knew Papa loved us. He always just fixed things." She returned to sorting. "I thought Caleb should know that we notice." Abigail pressed her hand flat on the table. Something enormous was moving through her chest, and she was letting it finally, not pushing it down to 3 seconds, not closing her eyes, just letting it come and find its shape. "You're 6 years old," she said. "I know," Sarah said. "You shouldn't have to be this wise." "Somebody has to be," Sarah said reasonably. "Jacob's too little. You're too busy. Caleb's—" she considered. "Caleb's wise about some things, but not about telling people what he's thinking. He needs somebody to talk to." Abigail laughed. It came out before she could catch it, real and sudden, and almost foreign in her own throat, the surprised laugh of someone who had forgotten the specific muscle required. Sarah looked at her pleased. "Mama," she said. "What? You should laugh more. You look like you again when you do." She pulled her daughter to her side and held her there, this 6-year-old person, who had been watching everything and understanding everything and keeping her own counsel about most of it, and she pressed her face against Sarah's hair. "Your father would have been so proud of you," she said. "I know," Sarah said. "He told me he was, before he got too sick to talk." She said it simply without performance of grief. He said you were the strongest person he ever knew and that you'd get us through anything. He said to watch out for Jacob and let you take care of the rest." Abigail held her tighter. "I'm trying," she said. "You're doing it?" Sarah said. "We have food. We have a room. Jacob laughs every day now." She pulled back and looked at her mother. "That's not nothing, Mama. That's everything." It was on the 26th day that Caleb appeared at the cabin door at mid-afternoon, not his usual time, and with a look on his face that told her something had shifted. She came to the door before he knocked a second time. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing wrong." He held up a hand. "Nobody's hurt." He paused. "I got a letter today. Offer from a cattle operation in Montana, good pay, long contract. I need to give an answer in 2 weeks." She looked at him. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't know yet." He held her gaze. "I wanted you to know it existed." "Why?" "Because whatever you're deciding about Aldrich, about what comes next, I don't want you to factor me into it in a way that isn't real." He said it with difficulty, the words coming out like something he'd been working out for a while. "I don't want you making choices that account for me if I might not be here. That's not fair to you." She stood in the doorway and looked at this man who had on a dusty road 3.5 weeks ago offered her water from a canteen without wanting anything back, and who was now standing here telling her to plan her future without him, so that she wouldn't be hurt if he left. "That," she said slowly, "is either the most considerate thing anyone has ever said to me, or it's the most foolish." He blinked. "How so?" "Because I told you it's not a no," she said. "And you're standing here building me an exit from something I haven't left yet." He stared at her. "I don't need you to protect me from the possibility of you leaving," she said. "I need you to decide whether you're leaving. That's all. Just decide and tell me the truth." He was quiet for a long moment. The yard was still around them. Somewhere Jacob was with Pete talking to horses. Sarah was inside with her ledger corner. "I don't want to go to Montana," he said. The words were slow and absolute. "I have not wanted to go to Montana since I read the letter. I want—" He stopped. "I want to know what this becomes." He gestured a small motion encompassing the yard, the cabin, her. "I want to be here for that." She held the door frame. She felt the weight of 11 months of every morning she'd gotten up and held herself together through sheer force of Thomas in the ground, and the curtains sold for 60 cents, and Jacob asking if they were going to die. She felt all of it, and she let herself feel it without using it as a wall. "Then stay," she said. "Not for me, not yet. Stay because this ranch needs the work done and you're the one who does it." She paused. "And we'll see what it becomes. Honestly." "Honestly," he agreed. "Don't write back to Montana today," she said. "No, ma'am. Write back next week when you've slept on it." "That's fair." "Good." She straightened. "I've got bread in the oven." She turned to go inside, then stopped. "Caleb." He looked at her. "Sarah told me you asked her what would help most," she said. "That you listened." He waited. "That mattered more than you know," she said. "Don't stop." She went back inside before he could answer, and she pressed her back against the closed door for exactly 3 seconds, and this time it was not to stop something coming out. It was to hold something in that she wasn't ready to give away yet. But it was there, real and specific and alive. That was different from anything she'd felt in 11 months. And she was not this time going to pretend otherwise. Caleb did not write back to Montana that week. He did not write back the week after either. The letter sat somewhere in his coat pocket in the bunkhouse she didn't ask, and the 2 weeks he'd been given came and went. And he was still at Hallbrook Ranch, still checking the fence line in the mornings, still appearing at the kitchen door for coffee. He never asked for, and she never stopped making. She did not ask him about it directly. She understood by now the rhythm of how Caleb Morgan made decisions, slowly, completely, without announcement. When he was done deciding something, he was done, and there was no use in the interim. She had learned to trust the interim. What she did instead was talk to Mrs. Aldrich, She rode into Sweetwater Junction on a Thursday afternoon, with Sarah beside her on the wagon. Holbrook had let her borrow. Jacob was with Pete, where he increasingly was on any given afternoon, and she walked into the millinery on the north side of the main street and asked for the owner. Mrs. Aldrich was a compact woman in her 50s, with quick eyes and ink-stained fingers, and the manner of someone who had been running things alone long enough that she'd stopped expecting help and started being pleasantly surprised when it arrived. She looked at Abigail for approximately 30 seconds and said, "You managed Holbrook's supply stores." "I did," Abigail said, "and his ledger, which was 3 months behind when I arrived." "Clara told me," Mrs. Aldrich said. "Sit down." They talked for 2 hours. Not negotiating, that came at the end, and quickly, because they were both women who knew what things were worth and didn't see any purpose in pretending otherwise. What they were doing for 2 hours was determining whether they could work together, which was a different and more important question. By the end of it, Abigail had a position managing the dry goods expansion and an agreement on the room above the shop, small 2 windows room, enough for a mattress and 2 pallets and a table at a reduced rent taken from her wages. Not as much money as Holbrook. Steadier ground. "When do you need to start?" Mrs. Aldrich asked. "I have until Margaret Holbrook arrives," Abigail said. 6 weeks originally. Probably 4 now. 4 weeks is fine. I've waited 2 years, I can wait 4 more weeks. Mrs. Aldrich looked at her with those quick eyes. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone more desperate," she said frankly. "Clara made it sound like you'd come into Sweetwater with nothing." "I did come in with nothing," Abigail said. "Then you built fast." Mrs. Aldrich said it simply without sentiment. "I respect that." Abigail put out her hand. Mrs. Aldrich shook it. Walking out, Sarah looked up at her and said, "Well, we have somewhere to go," Abigail said. Sarah nodded. That was all. Just nodded, like she'd been expecting this, like she'd known her mother would fix it because her mother fixed things. The confidence in that simple nod hit Abigail somewhere deep. She had not always felt like someone who fixed things. She was starting to again. "Doug," she told Caleb that evening. He listened without interrupting. He always listened that way fully, like what she was saying was the only thing happening, and when she finished he said, "Aldrich is a good businesswoman. She'll be fair." "I know." Abigail paused. "I wanted you to know that the decision is made. Whatever you decide about Montana or staying, I have somewhere to go. The children have somewhere to go. It's not contingent." He looked at her. "You're telling me so I don't feel responsible." "I'm telling you so the choice is clean." She met his eyes. "If you stay, it's because you want to stay, not because you feel like you have to." He was quiet for a long moment. The sun was going down. She could feel the temperature shifting, the specific relief of a Wyoming evening after a blazing day. "I wrote back to Montana," he said. Her heart did something she'd been expecting and still wasn't ready for. "I see," she said. "I told them no," he said. She looked at him. "I told them I had work here that wasn't finished." He held her gaze steady. "That was true when I wrote it, and it's still true." She breathed out slow, controlled, the kind of breath that did the work that words couldn't. "Caleb?" "I know you didn't ask me to," he said. "I know it was my decision, and I'm not putting it on you. I just wanted you to know I made it." "Why?" she said. "Say it plain." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Because I haven't felt like I was in the right place since I was 20 years old and my sister was still alive, and I didn't know yet what I was going to lose. And I have felt like I was in the right place every day for the last 4 weeks." He said it without drama, without reaching for effect. Just laid it down like something he'd been carrying and had decided to set on the table. That's why. The evening around them was still. She didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about what Sarah had said. "You look like you again when you laugh." She thought about sleeping through the night. She thought about the road into Sweetwater with Jacob on her back, and the hole in her boot, and the decision she'd been carrying about Elaine Foss, and how she had been so certain that morning that the only direction left was down. "I'm not ready to call it what it might be," she said carefully. "I'm not asking you to. But I'm not pretending it's nothing," she said. "Not anymore." He nodded. That was enough. For both of them right then, that was exactly enough. The twist came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before she was due to move to Sweetwater, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. She was in the main house kitchen when she heard the wagon. She didn't think anything of it. Wagons came and went at Holbrook Ranch supply deliveries and visiting hands and neighbors. She was halfway through the bread dough when she heard Holbrook's voice in the front room louder than usual, with an edge she hadn't heard from him before. Then a woman's voice, sharp and carrying. She knew before anyone told her. Margaret Holbrook had arrived 3 weeks early. Abigail pressed the heel of her hand into the dough, breathed once, and kept working. Whatever was about to happen was going to happen, and panicking in the kitchen was not going to change any part of it. The kitchen door opened 6 minutes later. The woman who came through it was 40, well-dressed by Wyoming standards, with the kind of face that had decided a long time ago that it was in charge of any room it entered. She stopped when she saw Abigail. She looked at the dough at the stove at the apron at Abigail's face. "You're the housekeeper," she said. "Abigail Carter," Abigail said. She did not wipe her hands and extend them because they were covered in flour, and also because the woman's tone had put her in the position of choosing to match it or rise above it, and she chose above. "I'm glad to meet you, Mrs. Holbrook. My father-in-law says you came with children." "Two, a girl of 6 and a boy of 4. Margaret looked at the cabin visible through the kitchen window. "That cabin is a working structure. It's not appropriate for—" "It's what Mr. Holbrook offered," Abigail said, still level. "And it's been appropriate for 6 weeks. Margaret's eyes came back to her. The recalibration was visible. This was not a woman she was going to be able to talk around. "I'm going to be reorganizing the domestic arrangements," she said. "I expected that." Abigail pulled the dough once more and set it to rest. "I want to be straightforward with you, Mrs. Holbrook, so there's no confusion. I have a position in Sweetwater starting in 4 weeks. I intended to give your father-in-law appropriate notice and leave things in good order. I still intend that. In the meantime, I'll do the work I was hired to do." She looked at her calmly. "What I won't do is leave before I'm ready, and what I won't accept is being treated as a problem rather than a person. I think we can work together for 4 weeks without either of us having to do either of those things." The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret Holbrook looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Surprise possibly, or the recognition of a specific kind of opponent. "I understand your position," Margaret said finally. Her voice had shifted slightly. Still sharp, but different. The sharpness of someone who had renegotiated rather than the sharpness of someone about to run over something. "I'll want to discuss the menus. I'm available any time after the noon dishes," Abigail said. Margaret nodded, one firm nod, and left. Abigail stood at the kitchen table for exactly 3 seconds. Then she uncovered the dough and kept working. Caleb found out about Margaret's early arrival within the hour. He appeared at the kitchen door with an expression she recognized, that forward alertness. That meant he was ready to do something about something. "I heard," he said. "It's fine," she said. "Is it?" "It will be." She glanced at him. She's not a villain. She's a woman who's used to being in charge, walking into a situation where someone else has been in charge. I understand that dynamic. He settled slightly. "How did it go?" "We established terms." She put a pan in the oven. "She wants to discuss menus. I'm available after noon dishes. It's going to be fine, Caleb." He was quiet for a moment. 4 weeks is sooner than you planned." 3.5 now. She wiped her hands. "I've moved faster under worse circumstances." He looked at her. "I know you have." A beat. "The room above Aldrich's, it's small." "I know. I could—" He stopped, started again. "There are better options, if you were open to them." She looked up at him. He was not quite meeting her eyes, which was unusual. Caleb Morgan, who always looked directly at things, was looking at the doorframe. "Say what you mean," she said. He looked at her then. "There's a house," he said. "Quarter-mile from town. It's been empty 2 seasons. The man who owned it moved to California. It needs work, but it's solid 3 rooms, a real stove, a yard for the children." He paused. "I've been looking at it for about 2 weeks." She stared at him. "You've been looking at a house?" "I've been looking at options," he said. "The way you asked me not to stop doing." "Caleb, that's—" She stopped, felt the size of what he was saying, the shape of it. A house near town, 3 rooms, a yard. "That's a significant thing." "I know what it is," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything you're not ready for. I'm saying the option exists, and I've been looking at it, and you should know that." He held her gaze steadily. "Because you should know all your options, all of them." She sat down. Not because her legs failed her, they didn't, but because she needed to be still for a moment, and sitting was the fastest way to achieve that. "Tell me about the house," she said. He told her. She listened. He'd spoken to the land agent in Sweetwater, had the number it would take to buy outright more than she had, and the number to rent, which was less than she'd expected. He'd checked the roof. He'd checked the well. He'd walked through twice. "You walked through it," she said. "Twice," he said. "You didn't tell me." "I wasn't sure it was worth telling you yet." A pause. "Then Margaret arrived early, and it became worth telling you." She looked at him. This man who fixed things without being asked because that was how he showed what he meant, because talking was what you did when you couldn't show it yet, and he had found a way to show it instead. Her daughter had recognized it before she'd let herself. A 6-year-old girl with her father's eyes had looked at Caleb Morgan and seen someone who fixed things and understood exactly what that meant. "If we rented that house," she said slowly, "and I was working at Aldrich's, you'd be stable," he said. "Real stable, not month-to-month stable. And you, I'd still be working for Hallbrook, riding the territory." He paused. "Coming back to town?" She felt the implication settle like something putting down roots. "That's a big change from a man who was thinking about Montana," she said. "I told you I don't want to go to Montana." "You'd be giving up the freedom of the trail." "I'd be choosing something over it," he said. "That's different from giving it up." She looked at her hands on the table. Thomas's ring was still on her finger. She had not taken it off, had not been ready to, had not been certain she would ever be ready to. She looked at it now. She thought about what she'd told him. "I don't know who I am without the surviving. I need to find that out." She thought about Mrs. Aldrich and the handshake and Sarah's nod in the wagon. She thought about Jacob laughing at the horse about sleeping through the night, about the laugh that had come out of her own throat before she could catch it. She was finding out. That was what the last 6 weeks had been underneath everything else. She was finding out what was left when the emergency ended and the surviving stopped being the only thing. And what was left was still herself. Tired and scarred and careful and capable, but herself. She was still in there. "I need to see the house," she said. He nodded immediately. "Saturday. And I need to talk to the children." "Of course." "And I'm not making any decisions today," she said. "I know. But I'm not saying no," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "You've been clear," he said. "You've been clear since the night you said it wasn't a no. I heard you." She looked at him. "You've been patient." "You're worth being patient for," he said. Simply, no decoration. She pressed her hands flat on the table and stood up. "Saturday," she said. "We look at the house." "Saturday," he agreed. Sit. She talked to Sarah that night after Jacob was asleep. She didn't dress it up or talk around it. Sarah was 6 and had been understanding the adult versions of things since she was 4, and pretending otherwise would have been an insult to both of them. "Caleb has found a house," she said. "In town near where I'll be working. It has 3 rooms and a yard." Sarah sat with her legs folded under her on the mattress. "For us? Possibly. We're going to look at it. Is Caleb going to live there too?" "No," Abigail said. "Not right now." Sarah thought about this with the careful processing she gave all significant information. "But maybe later?" "I don't know yet. Maybe later." Sarah nodded slowly. "I think he should," she said. "Eventually." Abigail looked at her daughter. "Do you? He makes you less scared," Sarah said. "Not because he does scary things for you, because he stays." She looked at her mother with those old, clear eyes. "Papa stayed too. That's the most important thing a person can do. Just stay." Abigail reached out and pushed Sarah's hair back from her face. Her daughter, who had walked 11 miles on tired legs, and held her mother's hand on a hot road and interviewed a stranger at a hitching post and kept her own counsel about all of it, and somehow, in the middle of a year that should have broken something in her, had remained entirely herself. "You're going to be something remarkable," Abigail said. "I already am," Sarah said with complete and uncomplicated certainty. Abigail laughed again, the same surprised muscle working easier this time. She held her daughter until the girl fell asleep, and then she lay in the dark and thought about Saturday. The house was exactly what he'd said. Solid. 3 rooms. A yard with a fence that needed 2 rails replaced. A well that drew clean. A stove that needed a new flue pipe, but would be good after. Jacob walked through it in approximately 45 seconds, and then went out the back to examine the fence with the focused attention of someone taking professional inventory. Sarah walked through it slowly, touching the walls, looking out each window in turn. Caleb stood near the front door and did not say anything. He was watching Abigail. She walked through the whole house twice. She checked the floor for soft spots. None. She checked the window casings tight. She stood in what would be the main room and looked at the space and tried to imagine it with a table with a fire going with the sounds of her children. She could imagine it. That was the thing. She could see it. She had not been able to see anything past the next day for 11 months, and now she was standing in an empty house, and she could see what it would look like with people living in it. "What's the rent?" she said. He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head against what Aldrich was paying her. She looked at the flue pipe situation and thought about what that would cost to fix and subtracted it from the first month. She thought about the 2 rails on the fence and decided Jacob would probably be able to help with those. "I want to negotiate on the first month," she said, "for the flue pipe." "That's reasonable." "I can handle the rest myself." "I know you can." He paused. "But you don't have to." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of what would be her house in the September light, that was finally losing its summer brutality and softening towards something more honest, and he looked like a man who had found the right place to stand and intended to keep standing there. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "Take your hat off." He blinked. Then he reached up and took his hat off and held it and looked at her. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, closer than she'd allowed herself before, and she looked at his face directly, all of it, without using busyness or distance or the next task as somewhere else to put her eyes. "I'm going to take the house," she said. "All right. And I'm going to work at Aldrich's, and I'm going to get my children settled, and I'm going to figure out what the next year looks like." "All right," he said again, still holding his hat, very still. "And while I'm doing all of that," she said, "I'd like you to come to dinner, on Sundays, when you're not on the trail." He looked at her. "Dinner," he said. "Dinner," she confirmed. "You and me and Sarah and Jacob, and a table that's mine and food that I've cooked in my own kitchen." She paused. "And we see what it becomes. Honestly, the way we said." He was quiet for a moment. His jaw had done the thing it did when he was holding something steady. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." "Good." She stepped back. gave them both the air to breathe again. "Don't be late the first time. Sarah has opinions about punctuality." "I've noticed," he said, and this time he smiled fully, real and unguarded, the smile of a man who had been braced for less than this for so long that more than this had genuinely surprised him. Sarah appeared in the doorway from the back of the house. She looked at her mother's face. She looked at Caleb's. She performed a rapid and apparently satisfying calculation. "Jacob wants to know if he can have the room with the yard window," she announced. "Yes," Abigail said. "And I want the one next to it." "Yes." Sarah considered. "This is going to be our home," she said, not a question. "Yes," Abigail said. "This is going to be our home." Sarah nodded, turned, and went back to tell Jacob. Caleb put his hat back on. He looked at Abigail. She looked at him. Everything that needed saying had been said, and everything that hadn't been said yet had been made room for, and between those two things there was enough to build on. She walked to the door of her house and stepped out into the September air, and the summer that had tried to break her was finally honestly over. Not because the hard things had stopped being true, but because she had walked through all of them and come out the other side, knowing what she was made of, knowing what her children were made of, and knowing for the first time in longer than she could count what the future might be allowed to look like. Caleb fell into step beside her in the yard. She did not move away. That was enough. That was everything. The road back had been 11 miles of dust and heat, and a hole in her boot, and a question she couldn't answer. The road forward was shorter, and she was not walking it alone, and her children were laughing somewhere in a house that was about to become a home. Abigail Carter had not been saved by luck or mercy or a man on a horse. She had been saved by the decision she made every day on every road, in every kitchen, through every storm to keep walking. And she was still walking, upright, clear-eyed, and finally unafraid.